Four boys rode their bikes into the Kentucky woods on a hot summer afternoon in July 1987. They were looking for one last adventure together before their families moved away. They had snacks, a flashlight, and a borrowed compass. They waved to a stranger walking his dog near the trailhead. He waved back. It was the last time anyone would see them alive. What happened next became one of the most haunting disappearances in Kentucky history. A mystery that would consume an entire town, divide families, and remain unsolved for nearly 3 decades until a hiker stumbled upon something that had been buried beneath the earth all along. A message written in a child's handwriting that would finally reveal the truth about what happened to Tommy, Jake, Mark, and Ricky. This is the story of the Lost Boys of Ashland. It was late July, 1987. The kind of Kentucky summer where the air clings to your skin, thick with humidity and the sweet smell of honeysuckle drifting in from the woods. In Ashland, a small town tucked along the Ohio River in Boyd County, everyone knew everyone. It was the kind of place where kids could disappear on their bikes for hours, and nobody worried, because they always came back. Houses stayed unlocked. Neighbors looked out for each other. The woods were a playground, not a danger. But that summer, 4 boys would vanish without a trace, and for 28 years, no one would know why. Tommy Hensley was 13 years old that summer. He was the kind of kid who led the group, fearless, confident, always the first one to take a dare. His best friend, Jake Porter, was 12. Quieter than Tommy, more thoughtful, but loyal to the core. Then there was Mark Dalton, also 12, the steady one in the group, practical and good-natured, the kind of kid who kept everyone grounded. And finally, Ricky Cole, just 11 years old, the youngest of the group. Wherever the older boys went, Ricky followed, always a few steps behind, but grinning like he'd just been invited to something special. The 4 of them had been inseparable for years. They rode bikes together, explored the creeks, built forts in the woods, and spent entire days outside until the streetlights came on. But that summer felt different. There was a heaviness to it, a sense that time was running out. Tommy's dad had been laid off from the steel mill and the family was moving to Lexington by the end of August. Mark's father had found work in Ohio, and they'd be leaving soon too. For the boys, this was their last real summer together, the last time they'd have the creek, the bikes, the freedom of those endless afternoons in the woods. They called it their one last adventure. On the morning of July 23, 1987, neighbors remembered seeing the boys in the Hensley family's driveway, loading up small backpacks. They had snack cakes, a flashlight, a canteen of water, and a compass that one of them had borrowed from a father's fishing kit. They were excited, laughing, talking about where they'd go and what they'd see. By noon, they were riding down Route 3, sweat glistening on their necks as the heat shimmered off the asphalt. The sun was brutal that day, the kind of heat that makes the air ripple and drains you if you're not careful. The last confirmed sighting of the 4 boys came around 5 o'clock that evening, near the old Colton Fire Tower trailhead. A man walking his dog remembered seeing them. They were sitting on their bikes, catching their breath, drinking from their canteens. He waved to them as he passed. They waved back, smiling. It was one of those forgettable little moments, the kind you only remember when everything after it goes terribly wrong. The man didn't think anything of it at the time, just 4 kids enjoying their summer. He went home, made dinner, watched television. He had no idea that those 4 boys would never make it home that night. When dusk came and the boys still weren't back, their parents figured they were camping out by the creek. They'd done it before without telling anyone. It wasn't unusual. But by 10 o'clock, worry started creeping in. By 11, phone calls were being made. "Are the boys with you? Have you seen them? By midnight, flashlights appeared on porches. Parents drove the back roads with their high beams on, calling names out their windows. By 2 in the morning, the worry had turned into something else. Fear. The woods that had always felt safe suddenly seemed infinite, dark, unknowable. By sunrise on July 24th, the Boyd County Sheriff's Office had been notified. What started as a few concerned parents had turned into a full-scale emergency. The boys had been missing for more than 12 hours. Deputies began organizing search teams immediately. Within hours, firefighters, state police, and volunteers were spreading out through the woods near Black Run Creek, following the narrow deer trails the boys were known to explore. Searchers found footprints early on, small shoe prints clustered together, heading downhill toward the water. It looked like the boys had been walking in a group, staying close to each other. But then, just a few hundred yards further, the tracks disappeared. They simply vanished in the mud near the creek bed. Search dogs were brought in from neighboring counties. Helicopters from the Kentucky State Police flew overhead, scanning the forest canopy for any sign of movement or color. Hundreds of volunteers combed through the forest, shoulder to shoulder, calling out names that echoed back unanswered. The air smelled like pine and wet earth. Every few minutes, someone would shout a name, Tommy, Jake, Mark, Ricky, and for just a heartbeat, the entire forest would go still. Everyone would stop and listen, hoping for a response. But the boys never answered. The families never left the search site. They set up tents near the fire tower, sleeping in shifts, clinging to hope that any moment the boys might stumble out of the trees, tired and hungry, but alive. Mothers sat sleepless in folding chairs, hands wrapped around thermoses of coffee they couldn't drink. Their faces were pale, their eyes red from crying. Fathers paced in tight circles, avoiding each other's eyes, carrying the same silent guilt. Should we have let them go? Did we miss something? Could we have stopped this? And Ashland rallied. Churches organized meal trains. Local restaurants sent food to the search site every day. People from neighboring counties, some who didn't even know the families, drove in just to help search. For a while, it felt like the whole region was breathing as one, driven by the same fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, the boys were still alive. Maybe they'd gotten lost and found shelter. Maybe they were waiting to be found. Hope is a powerful thing. It kept people searching when their bodies wanted to quit. But hope doesn't last forever. By the end of the first week, exhaustion began to set in. The search dogs were spent, their paws bleeding from the rough terrain. Volunteers were blistered and limping, some collapsing from heat exhaustion. And then, on the night of July the 29th, the first major storm hit. A heavy, violent rainstorm that dumped more than 3 inches of water in just a few hours. Creeks swelled over their banks, turning narrow trails into rushing rivers of mud. Entire search grids that had taken days to establish were washed away overnight. What little evidence had been found, footprints, disturbed brush, broken branches, was completely erased. When the storm cleared the next morning, the woods were unrecognizable. Debris was scattered everywhere. Trees had fallen. The ground was so saturated that searchers sank ankle-deep into the mud with every step. It felt like starting over from nothing. Harold Vickers, a sheriff's deputy who had led several of the search teams, would later say something that stuck with people for years. He said, "The forest felt wrong after that storm. Quieter. Like the boys had never been there at all. It was as if the earth had swallowed them up and left no trace behind." 3 days after the storm, a volunteer found what looked like a torn piece of nylon fabric near Black Run Creek. It was partially buried in the mud, tangled in tree roots. A backpack strap. Not far from it, searchers found a faint shoe print pressed into the soft earth. And nearby, wedged between two rocks at the edge of the creek, they found a rusted flashlight caked in dirt. It looked like it had been there for days, maybe longer. Investigators carefully photographed everything, bagged the items as evidence, and sent them to the state crime lab in Frankfurt for analysis. Families waited for days, desperate for answers. When the results finally came back, they were inconclusive. The items were too degraded, too contaminated by water and soil to provide any useful information. The disappointment was crushing. Still, the families refused to leave. They watched every lead unfold in real time, every false alarm, every whispered rumor that flickered through the crowd. Someone claimed to have seen 4 boys matching their description at a gas station 30 miles south. Another person said they heard a child's voice echoing from near the abandoned mining shafts late at night. Each report sent deputies racing through the dark, sirens wailing down narrow back roads, only to find nothing but empty fields and echoing tunnels. Every lead turned into a dead end. By the second week of August, the tone of the investigation began to shift. Reporters from Louisville and Lexington descended on Ashland, filling the small motels and setting up cameras near the command post at the fire tower. The story of the 4 missing boys dominated the evening news across Kentucky. Newspaper headlines screamed the tragedy. Entire communities followed the case, sending letters of support and donations to help fund the search. But beneath the surface, the town of Ashland was starting to unravel. The longer the search dragged on without answers, the more people began turning on each other. Some accused the sheriff's office of incompetence, saying they'd missed something obvious, that the search had been poorly organized from the start. Others quietly blamed the parents, whispering about neglect, about letting kids run wild without supervision. Rumors spread like wildfire. There was talk of a hermit living deep in the woods, a former coal miner who'd gone mad after the mining shafts were shut down in the 70s. Some people swore they'd seen smoke rising from his cabin in the hills. Others said he was just a ghost story, something parents told their kids to keep them from wandering too far. But in the absence of answers, people latched onto anything that made sense, even if it didn't. Harold Vickers, the deputy leading much of the search effort, personally hiked miles of terrain that had been marked as inaccessible or too dangerous to search. He was determined. He described finding an old, overgrown mining road choked with briars and thorns, leading to a collapsed mine shaft that reeked of wet earth and decay. They dropped cameras down into the opening, hoping to see something, anything. But there was nothing. Just darkness and stone. After 3 full weeks of searching, exhaustion became the real enemy. Volunteers began leaving, returning to their jobs and their own families. Food donations slowed to a trickle. The command tent at the fire tower grew quieter each day. There was no new evidence, no direction left to chase. The trail, if there ever was one, had gone completely cold. By late August, only the core group of family members and a handful of dedicated deputies remained. They stood together in silence as the sheriff held a press conference and announced what no one wanted to hear. The active search would be scaled back. Resources were running out. Time had run out. The official explanation was simple and heartbreaking. Too much time had passed. If the boys were out there, they wouldn't have survived this long. Not in the heat, not after the storms. The working theory from investigators was that the boys had simply gotten lost. They had wandered too far off the trail, maybe slipped into a ravine or gotten disoriented in the dense forest. Nature, they said, had done the rest. It was a tragedy, But it was also, they believed, an accident. But not everyone bought that explanation. A few locals still swore they'd seen strange lights flickering in the hills at night. Hunters claimed to have found makeshift campsites that looked recent, with cigarette butts and small animal bones burned in the ash. Some believed the boys had been taken by someone. Others whispered that they'd stumbled across something they weren't supposed to find, something hidden deep in the forest that certain people wanted to stay buried. The theories were endless, and none of them brought comfort. Ashland, which had been so united in hope during those first desperate days, began to fracture under the weight of not knowing. Families who had shared meals and cried together during the search stopped speaking to each other. Blame and guilt festered in the silence. Parents kept their children inside, forbidding them from going anywhere near the woods. The Fire Tower Trail, once a beloved local spot for hiking and camping, was quietly shut down. No official signs were posted, but everyone understood. That place was cursed now. By early September, the tents at the search site were gone. The command post was dismantled. The missing person flyers, those sun-bleached photographs of 4 smiling boys taped to gas station pumps and telephone poles all over town, began to curl at the edges and fade under the relentless summer sun. And for the first time since it all began, the forest was still, silent, empty. But for those who had spent weeks out there searching, calling names into the void, that silence no longer meant peace. It meant something far worse. It meant the boys were gone, and no one knew where. Deputy Harold Vickers kept returning to the woods long after the official search had been called off. Sometimes he would park his truck near the trailhead late at night, turn off the engine, and just sit there in the dark, staring into the trees. He once told a reporter that he could still hear the boys' names echoing in his mind when the wind picked up through the branches. He said the woods remembered what happened, even if they refused to give it back. The town of Ashland tried to move on, but it couldn't. Not really. Every year when summer returned and the heat settled in and the cicadas screamed in the trees, people felt it again. That quiet, creeping unease. That reminder that 4 boys had ridden their bikes into those hills and never come back. Ashland learned to live with the grief, but it never went away. It hid in plain sight, in half-empty classrooms where desks sat unused, in shuttered businesses whose owners had left town, in the way mothers gripped their children's hands a little tighter when they passed the old trail sign. The forest had reclaimed the paths. The search was over. But the story wasn't. Because even after the search ended, the questions never did. And somewhere deep in those woods, beyond the reach of helicopters and search dogs and flashlights, the truth was still waiting, buried beneath 28 years of silence. As the years passed, Ashland tried to quiet the ache that the disappearance had left behind, but it never really went away. The 1990s came and went like a long, uneasy silence. The town kept growing. New stores opened, new families moved in. There was new noise, new life, but the forest remained the same. Deep, still, untouchable. And the memory of what happened there in the summer of '87 never faded. For some, especially the younger generation who hadn't been alive when the boys disappeared, the story became something half myth, half memory. They didn't remember the search, or the helicopters, or the tears. They only knew the stories told around it. The way older kids swore you could still hear laughter echoing from the ridge on quiet nights. The way they dared each other to bike out to the old Colton Fire Tower trailhead after dark, flashing their lights into the trees and claiming they heard footsteps following them back. Parents called it nonsense, teenage bravado. But even they avoided that place once the sun went down. The old wooden sign that once pointed hikers toward the fire tower had long since rotted away, leaning into the brush, its letters half erased by decades of rain and sun. The trail itself was barely visible anymore, overgrown with weeds and brambles. But for the families of the missing boys, time didn't fade anything. If anything, it made the loss sharper. Every July, without fail, the anniversary of that last summer came around like a shadow. And every year, Linda Hensley, Tommy's mother, marked it the same way. She would drive her old rusted pickup truck up the same gravel road that once led to the search camp, parking where the pavement ended and the dirt began. Then she would walk the last stretch alone, her steps slow and deliberate, carrying the same small canvas bag she'd carried for years. Inside were 4 toy soldiers, one for each boy. She would place them carefully on an old tree stump near the ridge where the search had been centered, kneel beside them in the dirt, and whisper something only she could hear. Then she would sit there in the grass, alone with her thoughts, until the light started to fade and the evening shadows crept in. Locals got used to seeing her there year after year, a small, still figure against the vastness of the woods, alone, but never giving up. Others tried to move forward in different ways. Jake Porter's father couldn't bear to stay in Ashland. He moved out of Kentucky entirely, cutting ties with almost everyone he'd known. Mark Dalton's older brother joined the military right after high school and never came back to Ashland except for funerals. Ricky Cole's parents divorced quietly a few years after the boys went missing. They sold their house on the east side of town and went their separate ways. People said you could feel the distance between all of them, like the loss had stretched something inside them that could never be fixed. The case files ended up boxed in storage at the Boyd County Sheriff's Office. Dozens of reports, hundreds of photographs, witness statements, all gathering dust in a back room. But one man couldn't let it go. Harold Vickers, the same deputy who had led search teams back in '87, was retired by then, but the case still sat in the back of his mind like a splinter he couldn't remove. In his garage, he kept what his wife called his other office, a workbench covered in old topographical maps marked up with red ink and masking tape. Harold believed the search had stopped too soon. He was convinced the boys hadn't vanished near Colton at all. He thought they'd kept walking farther south, deeper into the Daniel Boone National Forest boundary, past the area that was ever properly searched. He spent weekends hiking those ridges, often alone, tracing creek beds and cross-checking them against maps from the '80s. Sometimes he'd come home covered in mud, carrying stones or scraps of rusted metal he swore were from old trail markers. His wife would shake her head, but she never told him to stop. Everyone in Ashland had their own way of grieving. This was his. The town changed slowly over the decades, but the story never fully left it. By the mid-2000s, the Colton Woods had been fenced off, designated as part of a restricted wildlife area. The fire tower had collapsed years before, its rusted frame slowly being reclaimed by the earth. But even as nature swallowed it whole, people still talked. Campers who ventured near the boundaries claimed they'd found carvings on trees, initials maybe, though most were too weathered to read clearly. Others said they'd stumbled on an old clearing where it looked like someone had once tried to build a makeshift shelter. The stories never stopped. Then, in 2008, something strange happened. A college student from Tennessee bought a box of surplus items at an online auction. The listing was vague, describing it simply as miscellaneous recovered property from police storage. No details, just a lot number and a starting bid. Inside the box were faded notebooks, random photographs, and one small canvas backpack. Its fabric was weathered and torn, stained with years of dirt and moisture. But on the strap, carved in faint, uneven letters, were two initials, T.H. The buyer thought nothing of it at first. Just old junk. But when they posted a photo of the backpack on a forum dedicated to cold cases and unsolved mysteries, someone recognized something. The tag number stamped inside the bag, a series of digits that matched an old evidence log from the Boyd County Sheriff's Office. It had been filed under the Hensley case, Tommy Hensley's case. When news reached Ashland, it felt like the town inhaled for the first time in years. The sheriff's department was contacted immediately. They confirmed it was the same backpack that had been logged back in 1987, one they believed had been lost or misfiled during years of storage transfers and evidence room reorganizations. The discovery reignited everything. Reporters came back to town. Television crews set up in the courthouse square. Detectives reopened the old files, dusting off boxes that hadn't been touched in decades. For a moment, it felt like there might finally be an answer. The backpack was sent to the state crime lab for analysis. Forensic specialists examined every inch of it. Inside, they found traces of soil, fragments of what looked like decayed paper, and a corroded zipper pull shaped like a small star. But no fingerprints. No DNA that could survive 2 decades of humidity and neglect. The fabric told no story. It couldn't say where it had been or how it had ended up in a surplus auction. The analysis came back inconclusive. Still, for Linda Hensley, it was something, anything to hold on to. She told reporters it felt like a message, proof that her son had once been out there, that he'd left a mark too stubborn for time to completely erase. For Harold Vickers, it was confirmation of what he'd always believed. There were still things buried out there. Waiting. He brought out his maps again, spread them across his garage workbench, traced new circles around old areas of interest. He said the ridge line in his notes matched the dirt samples found in the lab report. Same mineral composition as the hills south of Ashland, near the old forest boundary. He tried to convince the department to launch another search in that area. They listened politely, took his statement, and promised to review it. Then the calls stopped coming. The case was officially reopened for less than a month. A small investigative team re-examined files, interviewed surviving family members, and compared the backpack to photographs from the original scene. But when nothing new emerged, when no new leads developed, funding dried up. Media interest faded. Reporters moved on to other stories. By winter of 2008, the file was once again labeled inactive. The backpack was returned to evidence storage, this time sealed in a plastic bag with a new tag dated December 2008. And it sat on a shelf, waiting. Ashland slipped back into its uneasy quiet. The same families still lived there, walking the same streets, passing the same trailhead that led into the woods. The sign was long gone, the path nearly invisible under years of overgrowth, but the air around it still carried a weight people couldn't name. For most, it was easier to pretend the story was finished, to treat it like an old ghost tale told to kids who didn't know any better. But, for the few who remembered those faces, those names, it was never folklore. It was unfinished history. Harold Vickers never stopped searching. He kept hiking those woods until his knees gave out, and his doctor told him he had to stop. Even then, he would sit in his truck at the trailhead, staring into the trees, saying that one day someone would find something the maps had missed. Linda Hensley kept leaving her toy soldiers, one by one, on the same weathered stump. Even after vandals knocked it down, she found another spot nearby. The ritual never stopped. The rest of the town just kept waiting. And somewhere beyond the ridge, where the map lines blur and the forest swallows every trace of what came before, something was still there, hidden under decades of leaves and rain and shifting earth, waiting to be found. And in 2015, it finally would be. By August 2015, most people in Ashland had stopped talking about the missing boys. Nearly 3 decades had passed, and the story had settled into something old and tragic. Something that came up only when the summer air turned heavy and the woods started humming with insects, the way they had that year in '87. On a Saturday morning, a man named Daniel Merritt parked his pickup truck at the base of an old ridge west of town. He wasn't from Ashland. He was just a weekend hiker from Lexington who enjoyed exploring forgotten trails and off-the-beaten-path locations. The spot he'd chosen that day wasn't marked on any official map, but he'd read about it on a forum for off-trail explorers. Locals called it the Limestone Cut, a steep section of exposed rock and shale that used to be part of a logging route decades earlier. It wasn't a place most people went willingly. The terrain was rough, unstable in places, and there were no real trails to follow. Merritt had been walking for hours, making his way up the ridge, when he noticed something odd on the slope above him. A patch of pale stone jutting out from the earth, as if part of the hillside had recently given way. Curious, he climbed closer to get a better look. When he reached the exposed section, he saw that a portion of the limestone had collapsed inward, revealing a small pocket of debris tucked inside the rock face. It looked out of place, unnatural. Inside the hollow, wedged tight between slabs of stone, was a small rusted tin. It was old, corroded, covered in layers of dirt and mineral deposits. Merritt almost left it alone, assuming it was just old trash left behind by campers or hunters years ago. But something made him stop. Curiosity got the better of him. He pried the tin loose from the rocks, careful not to damage it, and brushed off as much dirt as he could. The lid was corroded at the hinge, barely holding together. When he carefully opened it, he found something inside that made his breath catch. A folded, waterlogged notebook. And beneath it, something else. An old Polaroid photograph, nearly bleached white from time and moisture, but still faintly visible. He wiped the surface gently with his thumb, and for just a second, the image came into focus. 4 boys, standing close together, smiling. Behind them was a wooden sign that read, "End of Trail." Merritt didn't know it yet, but that photo had been taken 28 years earlier. On the same day, 4 friends from Ashland had ridden their bikes into the hills and never come back. When Daniel Merritt got home that night, he couldn't stop thinking about what he'd found. The tin, the notebook, the photograph. Something about it felt significant, though he didn't know why. He decided to post about the discovery on a hiking forum he frequented, just to see if anyone might recognize the location or have information about what he'd found. He uploaded a photo of the Polaroid, the faded image of the 4 boys, and the trail sign. Within hours, the post had caught the attention of a local user, someone who lived in Boyd County. They recognized the sign instantly. It was the old marker from the Colton Fire Tower Trail. And those boys in the photo, they looked exactly like the missing boys from '87. The user reached out immediately, telling Merritt he needed to contact the authorities right away. By the next morning, the Boyd County Sheriff's Office had been notified. They contacted Merritt within hours, asking him to describe exactly where he'd found the items and to preserve everything he'd touched. By that evening, Merritt was standing beside uniformed officers and forensic investigators at the site, where he'd discovered the rusted tin, watching as they carefully roped off the entire area with yellow police tape. Forensic technicians moved methodically, photographing the exposed limestone, the hollow where the tin had been wedged, every detail of the surrounding terrain. They carefully collected the notebook and the remaining fragments of paper inside the tin, sealing everything in evidence bags before transporting them to the state crime lab. Even after all those years, after decades of exposure to moisture and decay, some of the pages were still partially legible. At the lab, conservators worked painstakingly to separate the damp, fused pages of the notebook without destroying them. It took days, but when they finally managed to read what was written inside, it stopped everyone in their tracks. On one of the last sheets, written in smudged, shaky pencil, were a few sentences that would change everything. "We went down the wrong ridge. Mark's hurt. The sun's gone. If you find this, tell our moms we stayed together." The handwriting was uneven, written by a child, but clear enough to read. And there was more. On another page, barely visible, were the words, "We're scared, but we're not mad. We stayed together." The next 48 hours turned Ashland completely upside down. The Kentucky State Police brought in forensic specialists and document analysts to authenticate the items Daniel Merritt had found. Paper analysis confirmed that the notebook's pulp type and binding dated back to the mid-1980s. The Polaroid film batch was traced to a production run that had been discontinued in 1989. Even the corrosion patterns on the tin matched nearly 30 years of natural exposure to moisture and soil. There was no question. It wasn't a hoax. It was real. The hillside where Merritt had found the tin was immediately cordoned off, and a full forensic excavation began. The process was slow, methodical, and reverent. Investigators used shovels, sifters, and brushes, moving carefully through layers of compacted dirt and stone. They documented every inch of the site, photographing and cataloging as they went. The deeper they dug, the more they began to find. First, a fragment of bone. Small, weathered, but unmistakably human. Then, a shoe sole with fabric still clinging to it, partially preserved by the dense clay soil. A few days later, part of a small rusted buckle, possibly from a backpack or belt. By the end of the first week, they had uncovered 2 partial skeletons buried beneath what appeared to be the remnants of an old rock slide. Forensic anthropologists were brought in to examine the remains. They confirmed that the bones belonged to adolescent males, based on size and developmental markers. Dental records from the original missing persons case were pulled from storage and compared to the skulls. But after so many years, the match was inconclusive. Too much degradation, but mitochondrial DNA testing offered something more solid, something that couldn't be disputed. The first results came back in late September 2015. One set of remains matched DNA from the Hensley family. The other matched the Porters, Tommy and Jake. After 28 years, 2 of the 4 boys had finally been found. News traveled fast through Ashland. After nearly 3 decades of silence, of unanswered questions and fading hope, the town woke up to sirens and news vans once again. Television crews from Louisville, Lexington, and beyond descended on Boyd County, filling the motels, setting up cameras outside the sheriff's office and along the ridge where the discovery had been made. Families who had long since moved away, who had tried to rebuild their lives elsewhere, returned to town. They were drawn back by something they'd stopped daring to hope for: closure. Linda Hensley was 70 years old by then. Her hair had gone completely white. Her hands shook when she spoke. But when a reporter asked her what she felt upon hearing that her son had been found, she paused for a long moment before answering. She said it was hard to explain. Grief? Yes. Relief? Absolutely. But also something else entirely. She described it as being handed the ending to a story you didn't realize you were still reading. For 28 years, she had lived in a kind of suspended state, unable to fully mourn because there had been no body, no confirmation, no finality. Now there was. The discovery site became the focus of an intensive recovery effort. Forensic specialists worked in tight grids across the hillside, documenting every object, every bone fragment, every thread of fabric that time hadn't completely destroyed. The notebook was sent to the state crime lab, where conservators used infrared imaging and chemical treatments to carefully reveal more of the faded text. Under magnification, they found traces of additional writing, simple lists, half-formed sentences, notes about direction and weather. One entry read, "We think the fire tower is east, but can't find it." Another said, "It's getting dark. We should have turned back." The more analysts studied the pages, the clearer it became. The boys hadn't been victims of foul play. They hadn't been abducted or harmed by anyone. They had simply gotten lost. Terribly, tragically lost. And they had known it. Investigators began piecing together what must have happened. Using the notebook entries, the location of the remains, and forensic analysis of the terrain, they were able to reconstruct the boys' final journey with heartbreaking clarity. The boys, following what they believed was a trail back toward town, had gone down the wrong ridge. Instead of heading west toward the Colton Fire Tower and then back home, they had descended south into a section of wilderness that wasn't even properly mapped in 1987. It was an area known locally as the Holler Bend, a maze of steep ravines, unstable limestone formations, and dense forest. Once they realized they were lost, they tried to retrace their steps, but the terrain was disorienting. Every ridge looked the same. The forest canopy blocked out most of the sunlight, making it impossible to navigate by the position of the sun. And somewhere during that descent, Mark Dalton was injured. The notebook mentioned it specifically. Mark's hurt. Investigators believe he may have fallen, possibly breaking his leg or suffering some other injury that made it difficult or impossible for him to climb back up the steep slopes. The rain that hit on July 26th and 29th, those massive storms that had washed away the search efforts, likely caused a landslide in the area where the boys had taken shelter. Historical weather records confirmed that Boyd County received more than 5 inches of rain over a 48-hour period during that time. The unstable limestone and clay soil would have been saturated, making rock slides and collapses almost inevitable. Forensic pathologists examined the recovered bones carefully. They found injuries consistent with falling debris, broken ribs, cranial fractures, dislocation patterns that suggested sudden, crushing impact. There were no signs of trauma caused by weapons or animals, no evidence of a struggle, just the slow, unforgiving force of nature. The conclusion was devastating, but clear. The boys had been alive when the storm struck. They had likely taken shelter in a natural depression or small cave along the ridge, trying to stay dry, waiting for the weather to clear so they could find their way home. And then the hillside had given way, burying them under tons of mud, rock, and debris. They had died together, exactly as they had promised in their note. Search teams expanded their efforts across the ridge throughout October and November of 2015. Ground-penetrating radar was brought in to scan the soil near the original collapse site, looking for any other anomalies that might indicate the presence of additional remains. The technology allowed investigators to see beneath the surface without disturbing the ground, identifying areas of interest that warranted further excavation. Late one cold afternoon in early November, the radar picked up a dense anomaly, roughly 30 yards downslope from where Tommy and Jake had been found. A new excavation was carefully begun. After days of painstaking work, searchers uncovered fragments of bone belonging to at least one more individual. Nearby, they found a small piece of corroded metal. When it was cleaned and examined, it appeared to be part of a belt buckle shaped like a small truck, the kind a young boy might wear. DNA testing confirmed what everyone had hoped and feared. The remains belonged to Ricky Cole, the youngest of the four, just 11 years old when he disappeared. By mid-November, 3 of the 4 boys had been positively identified and recovered. Only Mark Dalton remained missing, though investigators were confident he was somewhere nearby. The search area was expanded even further, but as winter set in and heavy snow began to fall across the region, the excavation had to be temporarily suspended. The ground froze solid, making digging impossible. Investigators promised they would return in the spring to continue the search. But in late November, just days before the search was officially paused for the winter, cadaver dogs were brought back to the site for one final sweep. The dogs had been resting and retraining for weeks, and handlers wanted to give them one more opportunity to search the lower creek bed before the snow came. Around 4 in the afternoon, one of the dogs alerted strongly near a section of the creek about half a mile downstream from the main recovery site. Investigators marked the spot and began a careful excavation the next morning. Within hours, they uncovered 2 more sets of remains. DNA testing would later confirm what everyone suspected. Mark Dalton had finally been found. All 4 boys were accounted for. Forensic analysis of Mark's remains showed the same patterns as the others. Injuries consistent with debris impact. No signs of foul play. No evidence of prolonged survival. The pathologist's report estimated that all 4 boys had died within days of their disappearance, likely during or immediately after the major storm that hit on July 26th through 29th, 1987. For Linda Hensley and the other parents, the final forensic report brought something they hadn't felt in 28 years. Not happiness, certainly not that, but a kind of quiet, painful closure. It didn't make the loss any easier to bear, but it gave the story an ending, one rooted in truth and evidence rather than speculation and rumor. In December 2015, the Kentucky State Police held a final briefing at the Boyd County Courthouse. The room was packed with reporters, family members, local officials, and residents who had followed the case for decades. A senior investigator stood at a podium and methodically detailed how decades of mapping errors, shifting terrain, and catastrophic weather had hidden the truth in plain sight. He displayed the original 1987 topographical map next to a modern digital overlay created using satellite imagery and updated survey data. The difference was staggering. The entire ridge system where the boys had vanished hadn't even been accurately charted at the time of their disappearance. What everyone in '87 had thought was an impassable bluff had actually been a gradual descent into the Holler Bend Basin, an area that had never been properly searched because it simply wasn't on the map. The investigator's voice was steady but heavy as he delivered the final conclusion. The boys hadn't been abducted. They hadn't run away. They hadn't encountered anyone dangerous in those woods. They had simply followed what they thought was a trail home, gotten disoriented when the terrain didn't match their expectations, and descended into an area where rescue was impossible once the storms hit. One of them had been injured, making retreat even more difficult. And when they realized how lost they were, they had done something incredibly brave. They had written a message, sealed it in a tin, and left it where they hoped someone might eventually find it. They had thought about their mothers. They had stayed together. And they had waited. The sheriff who spoke after the investigator said something that would stay with everyone in that room. He looked directly at the families and said, "They didn't get lost. We lost them." It was an acknowledgement of the failures in the search, the inadequate maps, the assumptions that had led searchers in the wrong direction. It was an apology, 28 years too late, but genuine. When the remains were finally released to the families in late December 2015, the four boys were laid to rest together in a single ceremony. It was held on a cold, gray morning at a small cemetery on the outskirts of Ashland. The service was attended by nearly the entire community. Hundreds of people who had once searched those woods as teenagers and young adults now stood with their own children and grandchildren in silence. 4 small caskets, side by side. 4 families, finally able to say goodbye. The cemetery filled with flowers, teddy bears, toy cars, and handwritten letters from people who had never even met the boys, but had carried their story for decades. Local school children had made a banner that read, "We remember." High school students who hadn't been born when the boys disappeared stood quietly in the back, learning for the first time what their own parents had lived through. Linda Hensley stood at the graveside, her hand resting on Tommy's casket. She didn't cry. She had cried for 28 years. Now, she just stood there, whispering words only she could hear. Later, when asked what she had said, she told a reporter that she'd simply told him she was proud, that he had been brave, that he had stayed with his friends, that he had come home. The service included readings of the messages the boys had written in the notebook. When the pastor read the final line aloud, "We stayed together," there wasn't a dry eye in the crowd. It was a simple statement, written by frightened children in their final hours. But it carried a weight that transcended the tragedy. It spoke to loyalty, to friendship, to the kind of bond that even death couldn't break. After the service, Harold Vickers stood near the back of the cemetery, hat in his hands. He had spent decades believing he had failed them, that if he had just searched a little further south, if he had pushed harder, he might have found them in time. Watching the caskets being lowered into the ground, he told a reporter quietly that maybe they had never really been gone, just waiting for someone to finish the story. In the months that followed, Ashland began to heal in ways it hadn't been able to before. The old Colton Fire Tower Trail, which had been closed and overgrown for decades, was officially reopened and renamed. It became the Four Pines Path, dedicated to the memory of Tommy, Jake, Mark, and Ricky. A wooden sign was erected at the trailhead, beautifully carved with their names and the inscription, "Dedicated to those who never stopped searching." Every December, on the anniversary of their burial, volunteers from Ashland High School gather at the trail to light 4 lanterns. They place them along the path, one for each boy, and let them burn through the night. The tradition has continued every year since 2015. People say the lights can be seen flickering all the way to the ridge, where the forest opens up, and the sky begins to show through. The notebook that contained the boys' final message was placed in a permanent exhibit at the Boyd County Heritage Museum. It rests in a climate-controlled glass case, open to the page where they wrote their last words. Visitors stand in front of it for long stretches, reading and rereading those simple, heartbreaking sentences. The museum curator said they receive notes and flowers almost daily. People leave toy soldiers, matchbox cars, photographs of their own children. Some are from other towns, other states, people who lost their own loved ones and found comfort in knowing these boys had not been alone when they died. For the families, life never returned to what it had been before 1987. Loss like that changes you permanently, but the discovery brought something they hadn't realized they'd been missing. The ability to remember the boys not as victims of an unsolved mystery, but as friends who had stayed loyal to each other until the very end. Linda Hensley continued her annual pilgrimage to the trail, though now she visits the cemetery instead of the ridge. She still brings the 4 toy soldiers. She places them on the headstones, one for each boy, and sits with them for a while. She says she doesn't dream about Tommy calling for help anymore. She dreams about him laughing, riding his bike, living the life he should have had. The woods beyond Ashland changed after 2015, though not in the way people expected. For years, parents had warned their children to stay away, calling the place cursed, dangerous, haunted. But after the boys were found, and the truth was known, something shifted. The fear lifted. In its place came something different. Respect. Reverence. The forest was no longer a place of dread. It became a place of remembrance. Hikers began visiting the Four Pines Path again, walking the trails that had once terrified them. They would pause at the overlook, read the memorial plaque, and continue on in thoughtful silence. The woods, which had whispered tragedy for so long, now whispered something else. A reminder that even in the darkest moments, there can be light. That even when all seems lost, the truth has a way of emerging. Every so often, when the wind comes down from the hills and moves through the trees, it carries a sound. Some say it's just the creak of branches, the natural music of the forest. But others swear it's something more. Laughter. Soft, distant, young. The sound of 4 boys who went on one last adventure and never came back, but whose story finally did. The case of the Lost Boys of Ashland became more than just a local tragedy. It became a reminder of the importance of never giving up, of continuing to search even when all hope seems gone. It showed that sometimes answers take decades to surface, but they're worth waiting for. And it proved that the bond of friendship, the loyalty of children who promise to stay together, can transcend even death itself. Harold Vickers passed away in 2018, 3 years after the boys were found. At his funeral, the families of the 4 boys attended. They thanked him for never giving up, for spending 30 years of his life refusing to let their sons be forgotten. They said he had given them the greatest gift possible. The truth. The town of Ashland still carries the weight of what happened in the summer of 1987. But it's a different kind of weight now. Not the crushing burden of unanswered questions, but the solemn responsibility of remembrance. Parents still tell their children the story, but not to scare them. To teach them about friendship, about bravery, about the importance of staying together when things get hard. And when people pass the trailhead now, when they see that wooden sign with 4 names carved into it, they don't think about how the story ended. They think about the message those boys left behind. One line, written in shaky pencil, meant for their mothers, but powerful enough to heal an entire town. We stayed together. Those 3 words became more than just a final message from 4 lost boys. They became a testament to the unbreakable bond of friendship. A reminder that even in our darkest moments, we don't have to face them alone. And a promise that no matter how much time passes, no matter how deeply the truth is buried, it will always find a way to come to light. This is the story of Tommy Hensley, Jake Porter, Mark Dalton, and Ricky Cole. 4 boys who rode their bikes into the Kentucky woods in July of 1987 looking for one last adventure. They got lost, they got scared, but they never left each other's side. And 28 years later, when a hiker found their message hidden in a rusted tin, the whole world learned what the people of Ashland had always believed. They were good boys, brave boys, and they stayed together until the very end. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the importance of never giving up hope, take a moment to reflect on the bonds in your own life. Remember the friendships that have shaped you. And if you know someone searching for answers, searching for closure, remind them that sometimes the truth takes time. But it's always worth waiting for. This has been the story of the Lost Boys of Ashland. 4 friends, 1 final adventure, and a message that waited 28 years to be heard. Thank you for listening. May their memory continue to inspire us all.